For more on this, we're going to talk to Michael Czinkota, professor at Georgetown University's business school there. And Michael, good to have you on the show again. I want to start with this. There's a lot of things to go through. Let's start with the economics of the meeting.
Okay.
Russia, the U.S., Germany, they're all major players. Economics is going to be the issue in the aftermath of all these sanctions, right?
Well, that is the largest issue, absolutely.
What does German Chancellor Angela Merkel want, you think, in terms of not just protecting Germany, but she also, in part, represents Europe, doesn't she?
Well, of course she does. And as leading spokesperson, especially in the economic area, she represents an area which, of course, is much more heavily dependent on Russia in terms of US. So even if both of us, meaning if the U.S. and Europe, commit something to actions to the same degree, it still makes a huge difference how these actions affect individuals and companies between the EU and the United States.
If they can't work out a deal, specifically on the gas deal that Jim Spellman was talking about, that's going to impact the majority of Europe. I mean, shouldn't they put pressure on getting the deal done on Russia as well? Because the rest of Europe hasn't said a whole lot of words yet.
Well, they may not do so publicly, but do keep in mind there's, number one, the Janus face of politicians, as I call it, because there is the official direct position one has to take because that's the thing to do. But then there may be many other ways one still pursues certain objectives. And if you look at how many business executives from leading European countries and companies have done their pilgrimage in the last few weeks to Russia to meet with Mr. Putin and to discuss new ways of doing business, I don't think that the EU is exactly silent.
Michael, I want to ask a strategy. A lot of people, some want the U.S. to do more, some want the U.S. basically stay out of it completely, and obviously there has to be a compromise there. In your view, the current U.S. strategy of these sanctions on people associated with President Putin, number one, does it work? And number two, what should the U.S. really do?
Well, I think if we look historically at how tools like sanctions tend to work, typically it is they don't. So I would not expect any of the sanctions to really have any short-term major impact. At the same time, we also have to consider what are the spheres of interest of nations. And in the U.S., we're sometimes being accused by others of sphere of interest. And it's being argued by some that, for example, Russia has its own sphere, to which, for example, the Crimea or the Ukraine would belong. And Europe and other places like China might develop their own considerations of what is in their best national interest.
Some talk of the NATO countries. Not all members in Europe are NATO, but there's some talk about including members there. Of course, as you well know, if NATO takes action, the U.S. is bound to respond as well. Is military option table at this point?
Well, I sure hope so, because if you think about it, in a little over a century ago, in 1910, there were a series of books written by nobility and by key analysts telling everybody that globalization has brought the world to new heights and never again shall there be war. Of course, 4 years later, one assassination later, all of a sudden the world is involved in a world war of huge magnitudes. And when one plays with military fire, that is always terribly, terribly dangerous, because you never know how long you can control it or what happens if it goes out of control.
Michael, I only have just a moment here. I want to ask you about this big election that's happening. This has been pre-planned. There's a big election, and potentially either they're going to be pro-Russian people in the parliament and leading Ukraine or non. Your thoughts on what might happen if it doesn't go Moscow's way?
Well, Moscow will, regardless of outcome, be very much concerned about its own Russian-speaking affiliated friends, of which there are many in Ukraine. Not in the majority, but there's a substantial number of regions, for example, where Russian is the common language. And Russia will try to exercise its prerogative as it sees it.
Well, it's obviously going to be a very, very big issue for all of us. I apologize, Michael. We're out of time. Michael Czinkota joining us from Georgetown University. Have a great weekend, sir. And just